Hello and welcome to this very special conversation with Mr. Andres Velasco, who is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics. He's been a former Finance Minister of Chile, someone who understands finance, economics and the intersection of government policy very well. So thank you so much for speaking to NDTV.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Let me start first by asking, we're talking at a time when the Finance Minister, Indian Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said that India needs 8% growth for us to be looking at our developed country goals and ambitions over the course of the next 25 years. Let me first start by asking you, 8% growth trajectory, are we on it? What is it that we need? And what should we be looking forward to in terms of milestones to get there?
Great question. Maybe let me phrase it in a slightly broader perspective. I'm here in Delhi to participate in the Kautilya Conclave, where I've had the privilege of presenting a book of which I'm a co-editor, called The London Consensus. And in that book, some of the world's leading experts on growth make a point that I think is very important. 25 years ago, we thought of growth as simply about getting the prices right, getting the static economy to be efficient. That may be important still, but growth is really a dynamic process in which you need a whole ecosystem for growth. You need companies that can innovate, you need property rights and the conditions for that innovation to provide private gains, but you also need to align a number of public inputs that are necessary for production. And I think that's a challenge for every country, including India. Whether that will give you 6% or 8%, I am not the most adequate person to issue a judgment on that, but I can see how the combination of, for instance, very strong universities and a very strong tradition in science and engineering, that is an asset for India. An economy which gradually, beginning in 1991, becomes more integrated in the world, that's also an asset for India. There's a chapter in the book about the importance of institutions, and particularly democratic institutions. The fact that India, unlike other emerging nations, is a democracy, and a democracy with a strong commitment to liberal values. I think those are all very strong starting points for India. Mm-hmm. One thing that I think would be important is for India to diversify trade. Clearly, this is a country with a massive trade potential, particularly in services. This is a theme which I've heard repeated several times at the conclave. And one question I would ask, given that services, unlike manufacturing, are potentially a very big source of high-quality jobs, mm-hmm. and India, like any other country, needs jobs, what can we do to make sure that services trade is very important? Okay. That helps fuel job creation, and that in turn helps fuel growth.
Interesting you mentioned trade. We're talking at a time of great global trade upheaval. US President's famous word, and I think probably the most likable word in his dictionary, is tariffs. Right. India has been at the receiving end of 50% tariffs. Forget the rationalizing or not being able to rationalize part of it. How do you see global trade right now and global trade dynamics? Do you see this tariff momentum playing out for the next couple of years, or do you think this is a very short-term blip before everybody discovers that new normal and tariffs sort of come down?
First thing I want to say is that there's no economic theory in the planet, certainly not what we have in our book, that would justify not only the high tariffs, but the very volatile and unpredictable tariff-setting process that the US is engaged in. Given that the book also emphasizes institutions and the importance of predictability, the fact that these tariffs are very likely illegal, both under American law and international law, is something that we need to worry about. Now, the reality is that this country, India, the country where I was born, Chile, and every other emerging nation, is facing a very different landscape. A landscape in which we have to keep in mind that the United States accounts for 14% of world trade. And therefore, there's a very large set of countries out there with which trade could grow. This is precisely why I was mentioning a minute ago that, for instance, thinking about trade partners and services mm-hmm. should be a priority for a country like India. And in addition, bad shocks like this one, I think certainly India has been treated unfairly. Bad shocks sometimes can be the incentive that countries need for additional reforms. Mm. And I think while India has been reforming quite remarkably since 1991, it is not hard to see, for instance, how there are sectors in the Indian economy that could open up further that could in turn provide for additional gains, more productivity, more trade, more jobs.
Interesting you mentioned about reforms. India has implemented two very significant reforms in the last couple of months, both on the income side as well as on the expenditure side, slashing taxes essentially, ensuring people have more income in their hands, and that sort of starts the chain of getting more money into the system. Do you think that will act as a catalyzing impact and effect to be able to kickstart the kind of growth that policymakers are envisaging?
I think simplifying tax rates is very important, no question about that. I would also say that any tax reform has to keep fiscal sustainability in mind, particularly in a world in which many things are changing, and therefore we need to be prudent with our fiscal policies, not just this country, but every country on earth. But if you think about the long run, it is important to keep in mind that growth is about innovation and productivity. And innovation and productivity have a relationship to tax rates, but tax rates are far from being the only determinant or the main determinant. So I would go back to the issues we were discussing just a minute ago. For instance, how does India leverage trade relationships? How does India leverage the very high quality of some of its world-class universities? How does that innovative environment move simply from abstract research to very applied research that can enhance productivity? I think those aspects, more than taxes in the long run, will be the determinants of Indian growth. And that's the sort of message we convey in the book when we talk about the ecosystem that is required for growth.
Right. So you're talking about high-skilled labor in terms of, starting a larger innovation cycle, and that could really be the next growth, inflection point for India, so to say. In the backdrop of AI, in the backdrop of several global headwinds that are happening, how do you see this panning out for India? Because we do have world-class tech talent that is sought after around the world.
Absolutely.
I mean, there could be some visa issues, there could be some Trump-centric issues, but this global tech talent is sought after, most sought after. How do you see this, and which are the sectors you see this actually contributing the most?
Well, something we know from research is that countries with a talent diaspora like India, and the end benefit, because those very talented Indians who may be working in Silicon Valley or elsewhere, sooner or later reestablish links with home and help bring technology and talent back to India. We see that process in place already, but I would expect for there to be more of it. I think clearly AI and technological change is an opportunity, no question about it. But we should be mindful of at least two things. One is that when we had previous technological revolutions, the advent of the personal computer or the internet or the smartphone, they did not show up in productivity numbers overnight. That is the first thing to keep in mind. There's a famous quip by an American economist who said, computers are everywhere, but we can't see them in the productivity numbers. So first cautionary tale here, let us not expect that within 6 months or a year we're going to be seeing companies either here or elsewhere being massively more productive. Second thing to keep in mind is that we need to make sure that technology is a complement to human labor, not a substitute. Now, this is a country where...
And that's a big concern for a country like India.
Exactly,
absolutely. We need to create jobs.
Absolutely.
And we also have the world's largest young people under the age of 35.
That is why it is so important for the world and for India to work with technology companies to guide the direction of technological change. Technological change is wonderful, but it is not God-given. It can be shaped. And people like Darren Acemoglu, the Nobel Prize winners, have been saying, look, we can work with technology companies to make sure that we, for instance, once we have AI, the applications that come from the existence of artificial intelligence, those can be job displacing or they can be job creating. And you can imagine many applications of technology and artificial intelligence in which a young woman, a young man who are not very heavily schooled, who have a limited set of school-based skills, well, those skills can be multiplied. They can be enhanced by the use of technology. So exactly how that will be done has not yet been sorted out, but I think that's a main task for the next few years.
So what you're saying is that AI is not going to take away jobs, it may create jobs as well, and Indian tech talent needs to identify where those opportunities lie.
Precisely, and I would add that these things don't happen overnight. one sad fact of technological disruption is that it creates a lot of jobs that it takes time. It destroys jobs sometimes very quickly. So there may be a period there in which you will see some churning, and that churning will have to be managed socially and politically. But the point you made, I think, is the most crucial point. Technology can be put to work to create jobs. And that's why I mentioned services earlier.
Yeah.
In the past, if you look at the way China or earlier countries like Hong Kong, countries like Korea industrialized, they began with very labor-intensive manufacturing. In today's world, growing exclusively through labor-intensive manufacturing seems very unlikely. To some extent because the world is flooded with such products, but also because technology has changed. So you can make the same goods employing fewer people. Employment in manufacturing is coming down in the world, not just in the US, in Germany, elsewhere. And therefore, the question is, in which sector can you bring together technology, productivity, and jobs, especially jobs for the young? Yes. My suggestion here, and we have a discussion in the book, is that services could play that role, and therefore a policy for good jobs, employing technology, taking advantage of productivity, not only in the service sector, but largely in the service sector, I think is the way forward.
Is where the
for many
opportunity
developing
lies.
countries. Exactly.
You mentioned about young people. One thing that many are talking about, and I'm sure this is a global conversation now,
yes,
because the Gen Zs around the world, whether you take Nepal, whether you take Morocco, whether you take Madagascar, you take around the world,
yes,
Indonesia, they are rising because they feel that opportunities are not coming to them. From a macro point of view, big picture point of view, what do you think is the aspirational economic goal of Gen Zs that policymakers need to keep and be mindful of?
Two thoughts. The first one, that this process did not begin just this year. Mm-hmm. We saw unrest in many parts of the world beginning at about 2019. Some of the unrest is generational, not all of that. One cause, probably not the only cause, but one cause, and one thing that we need to keep in mind, and several chapters of our book emphasize this, is that people care about money, but people care about things other than money. I'll give you two examples. People in a job get an income, but they also get a sense of connectedness, part of a community, roots, etc. We need not only jobs, we need good jobs. And we need to be thinking how these jobs are made better in quality, more meaningful. If you ask me, what do people want? Well, one thing young people want is a job that gives quality of life, that has some sense, that comes through with an attachment to a community, to a certain sense of pride. Second thing we have learned is that it matters not only how many jobs we create, it also matters where we create them. Because traditionally, my colleagues in economics have said, well, if you don't have jobs here, but you do have jobs there, well, let people move. And what we have seen, this is true, for instance, in Europe, within the European Union, people are free to move. Not that many people move.
Yeah.
Why? For a very simple reason, that if you move, you leave a community behind, you leave your family, you leave your friends behind. And we have learned in industrial countries that when the young move away, there are communities that go into a cycle of distress, despair, loss of jobs, companies move out, etc. So I think we need to be thinking about job creation. We also need to be thinking about where we create those jobs, what kinds of jobs. One way we put it in the book is that, the things that people want, the things that account for human happiness, for human flourishing, have to do with incomes and consumption, but with also more than that.
So what
and
you're
we
saying
need to be
is,
crafting economic policy to achieve that.
So what you're saying is that the social cost of any upheaval needs to be taken into account, especially when it comes to the aspirations of Gen Z. That's what you're saying.
I'm saying that, but I'm saying more than that, because even before we get to a cost, even before we have people on the streets, when we think of policy, and we think of how does policy have an effect on the creation of jobs, well, policy is not neutral. In what kinds of jobs? Policy is not neutral. Are you going to have jobs in the big cities? Are you going to have jobs in villages? How are you going to spread jobs geographically? How are you going to spread jobs across genders or across generations? Those are things where policymakers can have an impact. It's not easy. Once you sit around the table and you say we're going to design a policy, these are objectives that should be on the table. They haven't been on the table in the past, but they need to be.
Okay, that's where governments around the world need to
absolutely
focus on when they talk about Gen Z. Which brings me to ask, one of the final set of questions, which is around immigration. And this is important because you spoke about services being a catalyst for growth, especially for countries like India.
Right.
But look at the kind of sentiment that is there around the world with regards to immigration. And that directly impacts services and potential of services, doesn't it? What's your outlook, sir, as far as the very anti-immigration sentiment that one is seeing around the world?
It's a very important question. I have been a migrant twice in my life. I live nowadays in the UK, which is not the country in which I was born. So believe me, from the bottom of my heart, I understand that there's a benefit to having people be able to travel across borders and work, provide services in places other than the country where they were born. So I believe in the benefits of migration. At the same time, as someone who's been in public life, I think I have learned, and we have all learned, that migration comes with political baggage, because even when the migrants make a tremendous contribution to the country where they settle, which they often do, there are complications, sometimes with public services, sometimes in the local culture, sometimes in the composition of communities, and I think we would be naive and politically
but that
blind.
can't be for the highly skilled immigrants, right? That could still be for the low-level immigrants. But for the highly skilled immigrants, you don't see such fallouts. But the sentiment is still there for them.
This was going to be my second point.
Yeah.
First of all, I think countries increasingly will differentiate as to the level of skills or education of migrants. But let's go back to technology for a minute. Increasingly, technology will allow countries to deliver services without migration.
Okay.
If you're a very highly skilled radiologist in India, you can probably sell your services to a very expensive hospital in the US without leaving your city in India, because you can do that work online in a way that you couldn't before. Think about professional services of other kinds. You can be an engineer or an architect and provide services in India and build a building in the US or the UK or Germany or China for that matter. The same is true for other kinds of legal services, paralegal services, accounting services. A country like India is very well placed to participate, to be at the sort of the forefront of that boom in services without migration.
Okay.
And that is one of the great advantages that technology brings.
All right, there's a very positive and optimistic note, but I'm going to wrap this conversation with a final question, which brings around the one person whom I think has really upended global trade in the last 9 months, Donald Trump. He's spoken about immigration, he's spoken about tariffs, and the sense one gets is that he isn't done with this. Your thoughts on how far can global economy insulate itself from the weaponization of trade that America is doing right now? How far do you think we can actually absorb that kind of shock? Or are we pretty much are we maxed out already?
Let me say, first of all, that I think that these policies are simply not justifiable on either economic or political grounds, or they're bad news, not just for the world economy. I think they're bad news for America and for people who live in the United States. Having said that, I think the world economy has been resilient to these shocks. I think the world economy is beginning to find ways to adapt, but we haven't seen all the costs yet. For instance, we have not seen all the costs in terms of inflation, because many of the prices have yet to take in the new tariffs.
Yes.
Maybe some businesses have been betting that the tariffs will be temporary, so I don't have to increase my price. Well, if it becomes clear the tariffs are going to be permanent, well, businesses will increase prices. But more fundamentally, there are issues of efficiency here. Clearly, if the United States goes back to a structure of tariffs which we have not seen since the Great Depression, that will mean that fewer jobs will be created in the United States because the economy will grow less. And also, even from the point of view of American interests, the idea that with tariffs you will recreate industrial employment, that is simply a fantasy. Industrial employment has been coming down in the US, in Germany, in most industrial countries not because of policy, but simply because of technology. You can do more with machines and with fewer people.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think this is bad news. And every country in the world, of course, including India, has to be thinking, how do we live in a world in which rules of the game internationally not only are being broken every day, but the whole atmosphere becomes a lot more volatile. That is why I think it's so important to begin about using international institutions like the WTO, perhaps without the participation of the United States. A very good example, in fact, recently is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in which the U.S. withdrew, and the countries that are members said, well, pity, but we're going to carry on.
We're going to continue,
I come from Chile. Chile is one of the founding members,
Yeah.
and Chile was quite active in saying, hey, we have a club here. This club can grow even if the United States does not want to participate. One example of that growth recently is that the UK joined. The UK, last time I checked, did not have a Pacific coast, but we can change the label. Happy to have a democratic country like the UK, an open economy like the UK participating. I think we need to be looking for those opportunities.
That's a great note to end this. And for a headline, WTO without the US. We're going to leave it there, sir. Thank you so much for taking out the time
Thank you very much.
to NDTV. Thank you.